I remember back in college, probably a couple of weeks before we went to do a few work projects down in Zambia and Africa, the organization asked us, me and my teammates, it was me and 6 others, they asked us to go through a set of team building exercises. And one of the exercises that they had us do was called a trust fall. And what this required of us was each of us individually had to go up to the top of this wooden platform, and we had to fall, and we were hoping that our teammates, they were going to be at the bottom, and they were going to lock arms and they were going to catch you. So that's the whole idea behind this whole exercise. And so all 6 other teammates went ahead of me, and then it was my turn. Right? And so I get up on this platform, and I'm needing a lot of talking to by my teammates and even the facilitator who's there trying to get me to go ahead and fall back. And I don't know what it was about the whole exercise or this whole experiment, but I just couldn't fall back. And some people might say, well, maybe you were just afraid to fall back, just the fear of falling. But I don't know if it was so much that, because I enjoy going on roller coasters, I enjoy all these kind of free fall sort of things. But I think more of it had to do with whether or not I actually trusted the people that were down at the bottom of the platform and if they were actually going to catch me. Now there's a phrase out there, maybe you've heard this phrase before, but the phrase says that it's an equal failing that we trust everybody, and it's also a failing if we trust nobody. Now, if we trust everybody, someone might call us, maybe they say that we're too naive, right? Maybe we don't have enough life experience, we lack judgment, we lack wisdom. But if we don't trust anybody, then perhaps we are too cynical of people who are around us. Now, I always think about, kind of where I fall on this spectrum of how much I trust other people when I think back to that trust fall exercise that I did in college. And I for sure didn't trust everybody, but I also probably didn't trust nobody in this particular exercise because it was obviously hard for me to fall, in this whole thing. And finally doing it, you actually see that these people do care for you, that these people are people that you can actually trust. Now, I think we might find ourselves somewhere maybe in the middle of those 2 extremes that I just described. Whether we trust everybody or we trust nobody. I think a lot of us would like to find ourselves somewhere in the middle of that entire spectrum. And I know I want to try to find myself in there because I don't want to trust everybody, but I don't want to get to a point in my life where I trust absolutely nobody. I read an article about interpersonal trust across the globe, how well other people trust each other in different cultures, in different countries. And it was funny because as I was reading this article, there was other related articles that you could read. And one of the other related articles was titled, Can We Trust? Or Are Articles on Trust Trustworthy? So we can at least conclude that the authors of that related article maybe had some problems with trust and didn't quite trust the findings of this other article, which I'm about to tell you about. And so in this article, they showed us in the survey that they did that people in countries like Norway and Switzerland, that they tend to have a high trust for one another. But then you go to places like South America, maybe Brazil, El Salvador, Honduras, these types of places, and they find that people are actually less likely to trust one another in these cultures and in these countries. And this article particularly focused in on the United States, and we probably fall right in the middle, maybe about 50% or so of people would say that they trust other people who are around them, people in their lives, a family or friend, or how likely they are to trust a stranger. But it was interesting that these findings, they said that in our present time, if we were to look back 40 or 50 years, we trust each other far less now than we did several decades ago. So as we go through time, we're finding that we're trusting each other as human beings. We're trusting each other less and less each year, each month, each day. Now, we don't need a survey, to be able to tell us that trust is sort of dwindling between us and other people. All you have to do is go online for any amount of time that you're on there. You're going to find that people don't trust each other. You go onto Facebook and you scroll for any amount of time, you'll find that people don't trust each other, they don't trust each other's opinions, they question each other's opinions, and they also don't trust our government at all. You can put yourself in a conversation with people when they talk about whether or not they should give money to a homeless person. So in any of the cities that we're a part of, that we live in, you might find somebody on the corner of a street who's holding a sign saying that they need money. So put yourself in a conversation with these people, with people around, that have the means to give money, and you're going to have different opinions. People are going to not trust them. They're going to question whether or not they should give this person money, or whether or not this person's actually going to spend the money as they said they're going to spend their money. So we seems to me, at least, and I think we can conclude that we do trust each other far less now than we used to, and that is dwindling over time as we move through it. It's no surprise, though, and I think maybe you would agree with this, that a lot of how we trust other people is based a lot on our life experience. So if you go through life and you've had a pretty great life, and nothing terrible has really happened to you, people that are in your life, you can trust them, you know that they're going to be there for you, and so that's been the case for you, and so it's pretty great, and so you can go on trusting other people. But that's not always the case for everyone in life. A lot of people have been cheated, a lot of people have been betrayed, and so they then go through life and have a hard time trusting other people. And for our purposes today, we're going to find that because we have a hard time trusting other people, we're also going to have a hard time trusting God, trusting the Creator of the universe. And all we really have to do to see or to look at our level of trust for other people is we just have to think about the who, right? Who we trust in life. Right? Many of us have trusted our family members and our friends. That has gone really well. But for others, we've trusted our families and friends, and maybe they haven't come through for us. Maybe they let us down. Maybe they lied to us. Maybe they betrayed us. And so we can't trust them, and so then we have a hard time trusting God. We look at maybe what in life that we've trusted in. Maybe that was our money, or maybe that's our job. But in the whole present circumstances that we're all being faced with right now, with this global pandemic, with this coronavirus that is really destroying a lot of livelihoods in our time, we've come to realize that, and very quickly, I might add, that we can't trust in our money, we can't trust in our job, because those things, right, are obviously right now not guaranteed. And so we don't trust those things. We have a hard time trusting those things now. And so perhaps we're going to even have a hard time trusting in God. If we can't even trust in the things that we somehow can control, maybe our jobs to some extent, the money that we save to some extent, we can't even guarantee those things, right? Or trust in those things. How can we trust in someone that we cannot see? Maybe even think about when it is you tend to have an easy time trusting other people, or trusting in God, or a hard time trusting in others, or trusting in God. It seems to me that in the good times of life that we find it easier to trust, because actually we don't have to lean on very many people or lean on God during those times, because things are going well. Right? We don't have to depend on anybody else. But it's when the hard times come in life that we feel that we need to trust in somebody else. We need to trust in God, but yet we fail to do it in those times. Right? Because we haven't been doing it at all in our life, when the bad times come, we find it very difficult then to put our trust in someone that we cannot see. So we ask those very simple questions about our own lives, and we realize that there are areas in our lives where we do have a hard time trusting others. We have a hard time trusting in our stuff, trusting in the things that are resources that we have in life. And so if we have a hard time trusting in those things at times in life, how much harder is it to trust in God? How much harder is it to trust in someone that we cannot see? Now, what we're going to see today is we're going to continue with the series on Daniel. And Daniel has been a faithful follower of God, as we've seen so far in the last 5 chapters of the book. And Daniel has shown himself to be faithful to God. Right? And in the story today, this is the most famous, I would say probably one of the more famous stories that we find in the Bible about any character, and it's Daniel in the lion's den. And what we'll find in the story is that his trust in God is going to be put to the test. It's going to be put on display for everyone to see, but yet we're going to see that Daniel, even put into hard times, is actually going to show how great of a trust he has in God, which hopefully will be an encouragement to each and every one of us as we struggle through life, trusting in others or even trusting in God. So if you turn with me to the book of Daniel, chapter 6, here's how it starts out for us. Verse 1, it pleased Darius. Now remember, Darius was the king who took over for the Medes and the Persians when they conquered the Babylonians in the end of the previous chapter. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could not find corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, if you remember all the way back to chapter 3, this sounds very familiar. In chapter 3, we saw the advisors trying to scheme against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they are successful. These guys end up getting thrown into the furnace, right? But they come out unscathed, right? There's that 4th man that's in the fire that delivers them, that rescues them. That's God himself, or maybe an angel from God helping these people, and they are delivered. So if you remember that, it sort of seems like that's the pattern here as well, is that these advisors are now trying to scheme against another advisor in their ranks, someone who is very trustworthy, someone who is very close to the king, that they want to try to destroy his reputation. They want to try to destroy him in any way possible, but they can't seem to find anything. And so they end up coming up with this law to bring before King Darius so that they can really get at Daniel in this time. Now, what I think is really interesting here is that these guys go as a group, right? And that tends to, as you see in the biblical accounts, usually when people go as a group, it seems to be sort of mischievous. It seems to be troublesome, right? That's what they're out to do. They're out to do something bad. And maybe you might find this funny, but I always think it's kind of hilarious. But they say here, it says in verse 7, the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, and advisors and governors have all agreed. Right, that's what they tell the king. Now, I don't know if any of you are in politics or you know anything about politics. You probably don't have to know very much about politics to know that people in politics don't agree on anything. And to say that all have agreed would probably be not correct in our time. Because people just don't agree on key matters. And so they go to the king and they tell him, yeah, they have all agreed, to ensure that the king is not going to have a rebuttal and say, oh, well, some of them disagree. But now that he knows all agree, he's going to go ahead and institute this law. And so perhaps he even thought that maybe even Daniel agreed to this particular law that they were going to institute. And so we go down then to verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. A few of the interesting points here is that we see Daniel getting on his knees. He hears this law being put into place, and he instantly prays to God. He gets on his knees and pray, and as far as we know in the Old Testament, there are 3 people that are only known to get on their knees and pray. And that is King Solomon, who prays to God, I think at the dedication of the temple, for the sins of the people to be forgiven. And then we see a man named Ezra, who also prays for the very same thing, for the sins of the people to be forgiven. He gets on his knees and prays. And so we have to know that this moment that Daniel is experiencing, what he's doing, his actions, are actually very, very important to this entire story. So he's getting down on his knees and he's praying to God. And we don't know exactly what that prayer included. But perhaps it included a prayer of deliverance, or maybe it included a prayer for God to be with him during this time. But you know, even with this law being instituted and quote unquote everyone agreeing to this law, we still see that Darius realizes that this was a really big mistake. That this law that was instituted was really against his most trusted advisor and probably his one of his good friends, I would say. This guy, Daniel, was going to be put in second in command, and he is now going to have to execute him or put him in the lion's den to keep in step with this law that he had instituted. I mean, we know that it's a big mistake for Darius because at the very end of this section, he's unable to sleep. Right? There's no entertainment brought to him. He can't eat. Right? So he's unable to sleep because he has just committed the biggest mistake he could have done in his life. And so the story goes on. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So I don't know if we're sort of given perhaps an invitation to try to think about how we would respond in a very similar situation, and not putting ourselves in Daniel's situation. I think we can do that as well. But I think particularly putting ourselves in the shoes or in the place of the king. You know, he first says, may your God rescue you. May the God who you serve rescue you, right? That's what he said to Daniel before he was put into the lion's den. And then he tells him, he comes to the den the next day, assuming that he would be dead, and he sort of questions, right? Or comes in with a sort of hesitant sort of attitude, not sure if Daniel has actually been rescued, right? And perhaps we might think of it in the same way, right? We might approach a very similar situation where, and we won't be in a very similar situation, that doesn't happen in our day, but if we were put in a similar situation, maybe we would respond in a similar way. We would not be sure of whether or not God actually delivered his servant from death. But we know that for this king, Darius, that he sort of has an attitude change or a confidence change in God. Because at the end of this whole situation, he then issues a decree for everyone to serve this God. And he says a really key word here. He says the living God. We're down in verse 27. And that is only said by followers of God in the Old Testament. Someone like Hezekiah or someone like Daniel has used that phrase before, and there's a few others who have done that as well, but each and every one of them were followers of God. But yet we see this sort of pagan king, King Darius, utter these same words, that this God, who he's just experienced rescue this servant, right? He calls him the living God, which I hope is a confession that each and every one of us can make as we journey through life with God. So in this story, Daniel is in his 80s, right? And he is this second in command, or is going to be second in command, of all the 120 advisors that there are, or officials that there are in the land. And even though we might think that things might be going well for Daniel, it seems that the jealousy of these other officers is actually trying to rule the day, right? These guys are trying to get the king to institute this law that is going to go against his most trusted advisor, and again, I would say his most trusted friend during this time. But the king, he has to be true to the laws that he's instituted, right? But he wants to rescue Daniel, but he's not able to. He's bound by the law that he's just instituted. And so he has to throw Daniel into this lion's den. Now, from what we know about these lions' dens is that, there were these huge pits, and there would be this dividing wall between this empty area and another area where there's all these lions. And so when someone would be executed, or these lions would be fed, all of that would be placed in one part of the pit, and then the door or the dividing wall would be raised, and the lions would go in and eat, and then once they were done, they'd go back, and the wall would be put back, and then all of that stuff would be cleaned up. But from what we know is that these lions weren't fed very much. They were fed just enough to remain alive, and so they were going to be starving, and so whoever was then thrown in the pit with these lions would instantly be eaten, would instantly been torn to pieces. And so that's what Daniel was going to be thrown into. Now, if you know anything about Christian history, you know that throughout history there are a lot of what we call martyrs. People who have died because of their faith. I mean, you look at Jesus' disciples, 11 of the 12 of them all died terrible deaths at the hand of governments or at the hand of people. They were stoned to death, or they were crucified upside down. There are many other things that had happened to his disciples. And so we know it's not every case that God actually delivers, right, his people from hard things or from death or from the terrible things that they would experience from the hands of the people around them. But yet we see in this particular circumstance with Daniel that God does deliver him. But I think what's important to note here is that Daniel was still thrown into the lion's den. God didn't come and somehow change the mind of Darius and he was taken out. He was not put in the den after all. He was still put into the den with these lions. And you might find, if you look online, you might find pictures of Daniel in the lion's den, and you see this elder gentleman who's just sitting there, and all these lions sort of just sitting around them, and maybe he's like petting them or something. So we know God came in there, and he did work and deliver in a very physical way, but Daniel was still thrown into the pit. And I think that's important for us to kind of keep note of, is that God doesn't always deliver in the way that we might think he will. And sometimes we see with the martyrs that their lives do end in death, for them dying for their faith, and God didn't deliver them in that way. And so when we think about that, what is Daniel really trusting God for then in this time? I think we can probably read into the text a little bit and perhaps think about, we can put ourselves in Daniel's shoes. Like, what would we be praying about, or what would we be thinking about if we were thrown into a very similar situation? Now, if you're a follower of God, I imagine you would probably be praying for God to be with you in that situation. But I think above all, what's most important here is I think we would probably be asking God or praying to God to deliver us, right? To set us free in whatever way that might mean, or whatever way God sees best for our situation. But I think also that God would exact his justice on the people that are coming against us. And I'm sure Daniel would have been familiar with many of the Psalms, right? There wasn't a compilation of all these books, but I'm sure things were passed down. So he may have heard different Psalms from perhaps King David and other people, right? Where they cry out for deliverance from God, right? And that God would have justice or exact his justice on the people who are trying to hurt them, the people who are trying to kill them. So I imagine that would be something that Daniel would be trusting God for. And I know that would be something that we would be trusting God for in that time. But what is this trust built on? What is this trust of Daniel really guaranteed with? I think for Daniel, right, it would be rooted in history. Rooted in the history of his people. Rooted in the fact that God physically acted on behalf of his people and has always been with Daniel up to this point in his life. One of the key events for all Jewish people around the world is the Exodus. Because this is where God physically came into this earth and he did something for them. Right? He set them free from slavery in Egypt and set them free from the hand of Pharaoh in Egypt. Right? So that a lot of what they do, their confidence in God and their trust in God is built on that event. So for Daniel, he would have thought of that. He would remember that his people were set free. But he would also remember that God was with him at the beginning, even of this particular book, where we see Daniel, right, come before a king, two kings actually, so Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and he interprets the dream for them. And in this dream, he sees how God is going to be victorious over every kingdom of this earth, and over Nebuchadnezzar and over Belshazzar. And so he can't think anything less of God at this point. God is going to rule over this particular king who has instituted this law that has come against him. So he knows that he can expect God to come through in some sort of fashion. But I'm sure he would also be familiar with his three friends that were thrown in the furnace. That he would know that God delivered them. Right? They were still thrown into the furnace, but God still delivered them. So how much more could he hope for or trust in God for during this hard time in his life? Now, I know many of us may want to try to identify with Daniel more in this story. I know there are probably books written about how we can be more like Daniel. I know there are talks and messages that have been written about how we can be just like Daniel. But I think what we have found throughout this whole book is that I think we tend to find more identification with the kings in these stories. So in this particular story, all right, we go to how King Darius acts in this entire event. Right? I think it's an invitation for us, right, on how we would respond in the very same situation. We go down to Daniel 6, verse 16 and 20, and here's what it says. It says, this is what the king says, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" So there's many different interpretations. Many commentators have gone back and forth on this. Is the king certain that this God is going to rescue Daniel, or is he a little not confident about what God's actually going to do? Again, I think what this does is this invites us into the story and allows us to ask ourselves, how much trust do we have in God, right, to deliver his people? How much trust do we have in God, right, to show up in a very real way in our lives or in the lives of people that we know? And I think there are probably 3 ways, maybe. I mean, I'm sure if we really talk this out, you might have more ways than this, but I think we can boil this down to 3 sort of ways that we sort of have confidence, or we sort of have trust in life, and especially when it comes to trust in God. Now, many of us are familiar with that idea of wishful thinking. And I think the king is sort of there in this story. I don't know if the king is certain that God is actually going to come through for Daniel. I think he just hopes that he'll come through for him. You know, and we do this whole wishful thinking thing without even realizing it. I mean, you write an email to somebody and you say, I hope this finds you well. Or you tell somebody as a farewell, or you say goodbye, you say, well, I hope you have a good day. And so that's wishful thinking. Right? We don't know that that's actually going to happen. We don't know if we're going to find somebody well. We don't know if they're going to have a good day. Right? So that wishful thinking that we have, that small glimpse of hope that we have for somebody or this life, right, is not guaranteed. There's nothing sure about it. And so that is different, right? The sort of wishful thinking that we have is very different than trust, confidence, and hope, all of that balled up together that we find in the Bible. Because when we come to trust and hope in the Bible, right, it's built on something. It's built on God. It's built on God's character. And you look through every story in the Bible and you see how God has been faithful to his people. You see how God has never changed. Right? He acts in the very same way in every story because he's being true to his character. Right? So our wishful thinking, there's no guarantee to it. But when we begin to think about trust in the Bible, right, or hope in the Bible, that's built on something that is firm, something that never changes, something that is always there, something that's always faithful and reliable. Right? So maybe in life we might have this sort of wishful thinking attitude, right, when it comes to trust in God. Right? We're not super confident that he's actually able to do anything, or if he actually will do anything. So that's the first. I think we also maybe have this, we embrace this idea of sort of this uncertain hopefulness. Right? And maybe the king sort of thinks about it in this way, or maybe we would think about it in this way if we were in a similar situation, where we are confident in God's abilities. Like we know God is able. We know God is able to rescue his people. We know God has the power to do it. But will he do it? Right, becomes the question. That's the question that then creeps in with sort of this uncertain hopefulness. This reminds me of my daughter. When she was younger, and she could stand up, I would balance her out. I would stick my hand out, and she would stand just on my hand, and I could hold her out, and she would stand up straight, and she would balance herself. She would laugh. We would laugh and all of that, and she would stand there very confidently. I think because she was confident in my ability to hold her, and she knew I would hold her. But as she got older, I find that she is not as confident anymore. I think she's confident that I'm able to hold her up. Now, obviously, she's a little heavier now, so it's a little bit more difficult for me to hold her up. I think she's confident in my ability to hold her up. But I'm not so sure if she maybe knows deep down, like, yeah, he's gonna hold me up, right? He's gonna do it, right? Or maybe he's gonna let me fall or something like that. Or perhaps she just has that fear of just falling, that's keeping her from being super confident of standing out on my hand like she used to when she was a kid. Now that seems to be the tune, I think, that we sing in our day. I think we're confident in God's abilities, right? We know, we look at the Bible, we see the lives of other people around us, and we know that God is able to deliver his people. We know God is able to provide for his people. But the question then comes in, we let it creep in, that says, will he deliver? Will he act? And I think that's a fine question to ask. I mean, that's a part of the human journey, right? The human emotion, right? That we question some things of whether or not someone is going to come through for us, and especially for God, right? We question whether or not he's going to come through for us in our day. And finances are a good example. I know for me in the past when, I've never had like bad financial trouble or anything like that. But in times where maybe we were a little short or something like that, I always found myself growing anxious and growing frustrated, right? Because I know that in order to get money, you have to work for it. Right? You got to go out and get another job if you need to. You have to be smart, wiser with your finances and actually save up money and all of these various things that you've got to think about when it comes to finances. But the reality is that we can also trust God for our finances. We can also trust God to provide for us in that way. And I know deep down inside, when that kind of moment comes in my life, I know that God is able. I know He has the power to act in my life. But that question always comes up, like, will He actually do anything? I think where we want to move into, I think the goal for us, which is the third thing, is to move to a place where we have confident trust in God. And that's the idea of where we are certain in God's ability to deliver us, to deliver His people, to work on our behalf, and that He will do it. Now, that might mean different things, right? When God acts, it may not be in our time, right? We live in a very consumeristic culture, and like if we want something, we want it now. And so when it comes to trust in God, we ask God, and we ask Him to deliver us or ask Him to help us, and maybe the help doesn't come right away. Right? It comes in God's own time and comes in God's own way. So we've got to keep that in mind. But I think what we see with Daniel here is that his trust is there for us all to see. Right? That he was confident in God's ability to rescue him. He knew God would deliver him in some way or another. And that's why then we read in the scripture where we see, not only Daniel having this confident trust, but we sort of see this king kind of come to the same conclusion when he actually sees God act and work on the behalf of His servant. And here's what he says in verse 27. He says, "For He is," so this is the king talking, "for He is the living God, and He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and He saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." And so that is the goal for us. That's a place we want to get to. And now we go back to the story. We see that Daniel, his trust in God is built on life experience. Right? How he has seen God work in his life, how he has seen God work in the lives of people he knows, and how he has seen God work just throughout history. Right? He knows God is faithful. He knows God is reliable. So then when we bring it home, when we talk about our relationship with God, we talk about how it is we can begin to trust God, or how it is that we go about that journey. We have to realize, though, that this is not something that happens overnight. This is not something that is instantaneous. Right? We don't just become followers of God and instantly have this great amount of trust in God that if we were new followers, that we were thrown into some lion's den, that we would have that same trust like Daniel did. Or maybe even have that little bit of trust or confidence that maybe we see in the heart of this king or in the words of this king. It takes time. And it's like a relationship with my wife. Right? We, of course, had to trust each other to some extent, right, before we got married. I mean, that's the case with any married couple. You've got to trust each other. But that trust builds more and more as time goes on. As you have shared life experiences, as you go through times in your life where you're at the highest of highs and you know you can trust each other, but then you go into the lowest of lows, you go to the deepest valleys of life, and you know you can trust each other. And this is the same with God as well. Because our life with God is not just this, we start here in the pits and we're just working our way up here. Right? This from the bottom and going up to the top. Right? It's sort of this ebb and flow of our relationship. Right? There'll be high points in our walk with God where we feel like we are untouchable, right? That our trust in God and confidence in God couldn't be any better. But then something happens in our life. Some tragic event, or we feel oppressed by people around us, or we feel some mental distress, anxiety, or frustration, or we're dealing with some other physical struggle in our life or personal struggle in our life. We get to the very deepest and darkest valleys. We experience those times in our lives and we know that we can also trust God in those times in our life. So we go back to what we talked about earlier. We look at through life and we think about who we've trusted in life, what we've trusted in life, the times in life when we've trusted. But then I think the root of all of this is why do we trust in the things that we do? Why should we trust in God? Now we look at all the things that we do trust in and we know they don't last forever. Jesus says the same words to us, that everything is going to pass away, yet we seem to trust in those things over and over and over again. But there's one thing, one person that we can trust in. Right? And why is because he's reliable. He's faithful. We look at history, biblical history. We see how God has acted. He has always been faithful. He has always been trustworthy. He's always acted in accordance with his character. But I think most importantly, he's also shown compassion towards his people. He's also showed compassion to us. So it's not that we can just trust in God and he's going to be there. But we know that when he's there, he's also going to show great care for me and great care for you. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this time that you've given us together to talk about your word. We thank you that you give Daniel to us as an example of how to have trust in the difficult times of life, or really how we can show our trust in you. And even how we see the words of this king who maybe wasn't sure of your abilities, but then at the very end of all of this is able to confess that you are the living God, that you are one who has acted in a very real way for your people. And so I pray, Lord, that we can come to that point in our lives where we can have that confident trust in you, where we can trust in your abilities, know that you can work on our behalf, and not maybe have that question of whether or not you will, but to know that you will. And even though we may not be certain about how you're going to act, we rest in the fact that you will do something on our behalf. So, Lord, I thank you for your word. Thank you, Lord, that it is alive. Thank you, Lord, that it speaks to us, especially in what we've read today, that really penetrates our hearts. And so we pray, Lord, that after hearing the word today, that we can go and live differently, right, because of what we have heard. And help us to do that, because we know we're unable to do it on our own. We ask that you be with us, shape us, mold us to look more like your Son. In Jesus' name, amen.